the thing I did, applying to Y Combinator, they offered to give me this initial seed check, which I believe was something like 150K. And so that was the thing. First of all, I had a ton of respect for Y Combinator and Paul Graham and everything that and they were kind of like an idol or like a hero of mine, honestly. So part of it was like, wow, someone believes in me, right? And not only do they believe in me, they believe in me enough to give me $150,000. And so, and then the second thing it did was it allowed me to call my parents and say, I quit my job, but someone gave me $150,000 to try working on this new thing. And it's hard to like, it sounds like such a silly thing in hindsight, but I wonder how many startups just like never get off the ground because people around them are like, that's a crazy idea. And they don't want to call their parents and tell them that they quit their job to work on something crazy. So that's kind of the brilliance of Y Combinator. And I'll always have like a debt of gratitude to them, is like, they believed in me when this thing seemed completely crazy. And that was awesome.
I mean, so first of all, two thoughts. That first thought is a Hacker News hater comment is probably the most reliable anti-indicator of success, maybe more so than a Scott Galloway, hate tweet. But that's the one. And the second is, I mean, I can just imagine you calling up your parents and being like, "Hey, by the way, I'm going to work on this fake currency that doesesn't exist, but it's going to be valuable because everyone thinks it's valuable." So that must have been like a slightly trickier conversation.
Exactly.
You actually, you said something which actually I want to get to a little later, but I think this is kind of interesting now. You have, I want to get to like the last 10 years of crypto, but you always straddled, I would say, two worlds. Like one is the world of, the crypto community, which has always been definitely at least a little weird and eccentric, at least in the early years, still today, huge cypherpunk lineage, huge, focus on decentralization, anti-authoritarian in some ways. And then you straddle the regulatory world, working with institutions which have lasted for over 100 years and, working with governments. And you kind of almost a diplomat between these two worlds. How has that experience been? Because you might be very uniquely positioned in that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's always been this fundamental tension, right? Because on the one hand, I'm like, I just told you, I got excited about Bitcoin because of the freedom aspects of it. And like, in some ways, I very much identified with the early kind of cypherpunks and that ethos. On the other hand, I was totally okay putting on a suit and going in and meeting with, the California Department of Financial Services or whatever. So we had this unique blend of culture in the early days at Coinbase. And Fredersen was a big part of this as well, which is like, we kind of got crypto. We inherently believed in it, but we also were willing to go do the things necessary to make a company successful for the long term, which included, we knew this was going to be a regulated financial service business. It didn't do us any favors to try to fly under the radar or anything like that, which is what a lot of crypto companies were doing at the time. I remember one particular, again, early Bitcoin meetup that I went to in San Francisco. And I think it was important we were in San Francisco, by the way, because the right mix of people who were willing to try crazy new ideas was there, at least at that time. So we went to one of these early Bitcoin meetups, and I remember I had just gotten back from like a meeting with a bank, and we were trying to get a bank account open. And so I was wearing kind of like nice shoes or something like that. And I went to this Bitcoin meetup, and this guy kind of got in my face, and he like kind of put his finger in my face, and and he was like, he's like, "You're just trying to create a bank for Bitcoin. Like, you even look like one of the bankers. Like, look at your shoes, So I went from like bank meeting to like anarchist hacker meeting, and was trying to play both sides of it, but it was never super easy. So I think to this day, we sort of sit in the middle, where like I think a lot of the really early crypto people, Bitcoin people, they kind of look at us like with a little bit of suspicion, and they're like, I mean, is Coinbase just kind of like the man, and they're the centralized kind of entity that's going to, destroy the true values? And then, some regulators and folks in government are still skeptical of Coinbase, usually until they meet us and they get to know us. And they're thinking, hey, isn't this just some tool for money laundering? And so we've always had to try to bridge that divide and like speak both languages, which has been an interesting process.
Avichal?
Yeah, Brian, I'm actually, speaking of moderation, I'm really curious, how did you manage the cycles in crypto personally? Like, there were a lot of people, I mean, myself included, that had Bitcoin early, and then you went through one cycle and it cratered out, and along the way, everybody kind of sold and said, okay, maybe this thing is dead. And, there aren't that many people that were around in 2010, 2011, 2012 that stuck it out for a decade. And I'm really curious what where did that conviction come from? How did you hang on through all those cycles?
Yeah, totally. I mean, so there are a handful of crypto companies from back then that are still around. Kraken, blockchain are some examples, but there's a lot that were around then that are no longer around. So why did I stick it out through the cycles? I mean, one thing is, like, I've always had this very long-term view. So I knew that this stuff wasn't going to happen overnight. I also wasn't doing it to like try to make a quick buck or exit the company or flip it or something like that. I was doing it because I really believed in the idea behind Bitcoin. I wanted there to be a decentralized global currency for the world because I felt like it would bring more economic freedom. So I was all in on that. Another part of it is just my personality is like a little unique in that I don't really get that excited about things. And I don't really get that like down about things either. I do feel all those things, but I feel like in a more moderated version than a lot of people do. So that's been I think it's kind of sometimes that's a weakness. Like sometimes some really great thing will happen and the team is like, Brian, why aren't you celebrating? And I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot we have to celebrate. But other times, it just, the world could be on fire, like 10 bad things happen in a row. And I'm just like, all right, what's the next step? Let's keep moving. I remember, there was one day early on at Coinbase where like it seemed like everything was going wrong. It's like, I think somebody quit. We got some kind of lawsuit in the mail. There was some bug on the website. We were there till like 2 a.m. working and just kind of put one foot in front of the other. And I finally got time to go home. And so I went back to my apartment and there was somebody waiting in the lobby. And this guy was like, are you Brian Armstrong in this unit or whatever? I was like, yep. He's like, so your apartment has been flooded. There was some leak in the floors above and you're like the last person to come home. And I was like, okay, do I need to sleep in a hotel or am I staying here tonight? And I was just sort of super calm about the whole thing. Like, what's the next step? Well, how do we solve this? And the guy kind of looked at me funny. He was like, he was like a, flood repair type. He's like, I've told a lot of people over the years that their apartment has been flooded and you're ridiculously calm right now. And so I don't know, there's something about my personality that just kind of sticks with it. So
just so you know, Aarti will testify that that is not how I would have handled said situation.
Yep.
Maybe we can hear that story later, Aarti.
Never. So Brian, so fast forwarding a bit, you have this amazing post which I really love, which is I think you wrote this beginning of last year, right before COVID, I would say. So, but you said what happened in crypto over the last decade, because it's fair to say that there's been a bunch of interesting things which happened over the last 10 years for all things crypto, from everything from ICOs to the resurgence of the Winklevoss twins for a potential social network sequel. There's been a lot. So, and I wanted people to read the blog post, but in your mind, just, having been at the center of all things for the last 10 years, what really stands out to you when you look at, the evolution of crypto and Bitcoin, or just crypto in general, not Bitcoin?
Yeah, over the past 10 years.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the Bitcoin white paper got written in 2008. The first time I saw it was 2010. And so if you think about 2010 to 2020, what happened? I mean, clearly a lot more people found out about Bitcoin, but it was a series of basically bubbles and corrections overall in an upward channel, right? I think Bitcoin was it was the best performing asset of that decade across any asset, which is kind of an interesting stat. But in that period, it had massive, ups and downs and volatility. And every time it hit a new kind of peak, a whole new order of magnitude of people in the world kind of found out about crypto, got interested in it, all that stuff. Another thing that happened was that, like, the communities kind of, I would say, broke into factions, and there was new coins that came on the scene, right? So we saw Ethereum and other things get created. We saw the ICO bubbles start to happen. But we also saw Bitcoin split, right? And there was a big debate in that decade about how is Bitcoin going to scale? Is it going to scale? Will that harm decentralization? And I actually jumped into the middle of this, it was probably a mistake in hindsight, but my view was, hey, we really need to get Bitcoin to scale. That's how we're going to get it to be a global payment system for the world, not just kind of digital gold. There was a bunch of differing opinions on that. It's either a feature or a bug, depending on how you think of it in terms of the decentralized nature of it, I guess, in that sense, was protecting the core thing, but it didn't have any like kind of leader at that point. There was no Linus Torvalds like Unix, right, or Linux, I should say. Satoshi was gone at that point, and Gavin Andreessen, who had sort of been handed the keys as the unofficial open source leader, had sort of stepped down, and he wasn't really ready to be that kind of a public facing figure with tons of turmoil and opinions. So it had fully decentralized, and the factions sort of started going to war with each other. And so we saw Bitcoin Cash peel off, and a whole bunch of other blockchains jump on the scene, which each had their own properties. So I guess the last thing I'll mention is, you can jump into any of these if you want in more detail, is that at the beginning of the decade 2010, I read the Bitcoin white paper. If you had asked me what would this be in 5 years, I would have said this thing is going to be really starting to work as a global payment network. Like, people are going to be doing remittances. They're going to be building new kinds of applications on financial services. And I was basically completely wrong on that. I mean, it took much longer. It wasn't until 10 years where we started to see the very beginnings of things like stablecoins, DeFi, payments start to work. And this, this is all, basically it didn't scale. Like, we're still in kind of like an internet analogy would be, we're still all on dial-up. So the blockchains are not that scalable. And so there's a bunch of work happening, I think, in the next decade where that might happen. But the first decade was characterized by all those things.
Okay, I want to jump. That'd be great. And by the way, for folks, I want to jump into a couple of those. But before that, we are a half past the hour. We always reset the room. So everybody, thank you for tuning in for what is probably Clubhouse's largest single room ever. So no pressure, Brian, but you just kind of got the biggest audience here. And I can tell you, Twitter has been blowing up, especially the reveal of Marc Andreessen being Satoshi Nakamoto. That was kind of quite the highlight. But again, thank you so much. It's a good time show that Ati and I do every single, most single days. And today we have a very special guest in Coinbase, co-founder and CEO, Brian Armstrong. Brian, okay. So
hey, Sriram.
Dig into when it. Sorry, Mark.
I just want to point out that before you did the reset, Brian pointed out that the maintainer of Core Bitcoin was a gentleman named Gavin Andreessen. And I just want to note that, just for the record, that he's literally the only other person with my last name I've ever met outside of my family. And so I would just like to propose that it is, in fact, a complete coincidence that we happen to share the same last name, and has nothing to do with whether or not I am Satoshi.
Again, I don't want to, give suggestions to people on Twitter, but I feel like somebody should create one of those mustache on, mustache off photos with, Marc Andreessen and a different Andreessen who just happens to not be you.
I would never endorse such a thing.
Okay. Anyway, so Brian, I think there's a bunch of stuff that I want to dig into the last decade, but the thing which I think you touched on, which is about factions and the various people involved, and also tying to your comment on Linus and Linux, which is, I think you once spoke about the importance of personalities like Linux, Linus for Linux, John Carmack for all things graphics, and I would say people like Vitalik for all things crypto. Give me your thoughts on just the importance of individuals like that for communities, and also, how much has diplomacy and almost these quasi geopolitical negotiations and consensus building, been important to crypto?
Well, okay, I'm not sure about the second part of that question, but the first part, look, I think those personalities matter a lot, right? Ethereum with Vitalik, it's not that he has the ultimate decision-making power to change the whole network, because it is decentralized. I mean, if he proposes something that the miners or the exchanges or the individuals running nodes don't agree with, they're not going to upgrade. And so he doesn't have absolute power, but he is kind of a spiritual leader. He can help break ties and help give a sense of sort of like a trusted hand, I guess, guiding it, which is I think really important. Unfortunately, since Mark, after creating Bitcoin, abdicated his responsibility and turned it over to another Andreessen, it did feel like it was decentralized. And so the factions kind of came out. I guess, I remember reading this book one time about Genghis Khan, and he conquered this massive area in his lifetime, and then shortly after his death, the various sons kind of all broke into factions. And so there's a weird, I don't know, something there about human nature.
Okay, sorry. Okay, we spoke of the last 10 years, and I think the follow-up post that you had was about the next 10 years for all things crypto. So could you give us a sense of like what, when you look at the next 10 years, just super broadly in the crypto ecosystem, what excites you? What do you see happening?
Yeah, sure. Actually, one thing I was going to mention just before we move on from the last decade was we had to go figure out regulation, which I think is interesting. Like I've always want to tell people about this because there's a lot of people trying to start companies in regulated industries, and it's always this question of do I go out very early on before we even launch the product and go get every license under the sun, or do we just try to fly under the radar at first? And you're always kind of trying to strike the right balance. I remember before starting Coinbase, I read this interesting book. It was called PayPal Wars, and it's about the founding of PayPal. Mm-hmm. And I later learned that I think Square went through something kind of similar, where a lot of this financial services companies, they sort of got off the ground. They had their initial product. Companies actually often go out and get like a legal opinion letter to sort of saying, hey, we believe that we're operating in these ways, which is okay. But then they eventually have to go get these licenses, which require a lot of capital and a lot of VC. Like, in our case, it cost many millions of dollars and took many years to kind of go get our money transmitter licenses in the US, which was the first thing that we went out to actually go get. We've now gone and gotten a bunch of others federally in the US and in Europe and other places. So, we don't want to ever break the law, but as a startup, you have to get something out and find the right times to go invest in that stuff. So, crypto for a long time, people thought, hey, this is a totally unregulated thing. And I'm sitting there with 50 state regulators, probably 6 or 7 at the federal level. And that's just in the US. And so anyway, just wanted to mention that story about how startups have to get off the ground. Okay. So,
by the way, I think one thing we should all find out, like that was so non-consensus at the time, because working with regulators at the time would have seemed, I think a lot of people were like, that's just a fool's errand and would have seemed like unsurmountable. So it was not the widely, consensus, strategic decision at the time when you guys did that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, we called some of these regulators and it's like, hey, we're a Bitcoin company, do we need to get this thing? And they're like, we don't know what that is. And we could have just hung up and said, okay, I guess we're okay. But that's not what they said. They just said they didn't know what it was. And so, what we did instead was we tried to be an educational resource and an advocate. And like, we said, hey, can we come meet with you? Like, we want to just talk to you about this, maybe even educate you on it. And in some cases, we went and applied for license even before it was even needed, because we felt like, we just need to try to make this industry legitimate and have it not be operating in the shadows. There was banks at that time. We were trying to get bank accounts set up too. Getting a bank account for a crypto company was a very difficult thing to do in that day. And actually, Dan has probably a good story here about the time that we got debanked. I don't know if we want to tell that one. But I remember we showed up at a lot of these banks, and they were asking us about these licenses, and we realized, like, okay, we've got to go out and get them. So anyway, as you said, counterintuitive strategy. We actually went out and embraced regulation, which no other crypto company was doing at that time, as far as I can recall.
Okay, so next 10 years, by the way, for folks, Brian has 2 amazing blog posts, both the last 10 years and the next 10 years on the Coinbase blog, which I highly recommend. But Brian, looking out of the next 10 years broadly over crypto, what excites you? What do you see happening?
Yeah. Okay. Well, so one thing is that I just think blockchains are finally getting a little more scalable. That's really important to me, because if we can't go from more than like 25 transactions per second or something, we need to get that to be at least a couple thousand transactions per second, and ideally, 10,000 or more, to really get all the use cases working. So that's working now with things people are doing with like optimistic rollups on Ethereum. There's Ethereum 2. There's layer 2 solutions happening on Bitcoin. There's a whole bunch of scalability. So that's, again, it's kind of like the internet going from dial-up to broadband. It's going to actually unlock, I think, a ton of use cases that people aren't fully thinking about. The other thing is we're seeing a whole new wave of like DeFi adoption. We're seeing NFTs have kind of a moment here, non-fungible tokens, which are like, unique digital goods, whether that's art or domain names or, things you can own in the metaverse, like real estate. I think that's really cool. There's also just like There's central bank digital currencies we could talk about, like China and the US are getting really into that. Central, stable coins, like there's a whole new crop of startups happening. I don't know, which ones do you want to talk about first?
Oh, I think we should talk about all of them. And in fact, I think we are. But before that, I think I want to get to one thing before I think we're going to dig deep into DeFi. We're going to dig deep into NFTs. We're going to talk about especially China and stablecoins. But before that, I think, there's one topic which has kind of come up a lot. I would say, to put it mildly, you've kind of gotten some attention over the last 6 to 8 months, especially around your blog post about being a mission-focused company. And I would say there's been a bunch of interest. Could you just talk to us about what being a mission-focused company means to you?
Yeah, sure. So as you grow a company, you have more and more people joining. And one of your jobs as CEO is you got to make sure everybody is rowing in the same direction, right? You hire all these smart people from so many different backgrounds. So there's some things you want people to have in common, like they want to be excited about the mission of the company. You want them to have the values of the company, but kind of on every other dimension, you want them to be different. You want them to have totally different skill sets, come from different backgrounds, and then you kind of get them to come together and join on this common mission. And you hopefully build great products and do great things. One of the challenges that I ran into last year was that I hit a moment in the middle of the year where I realized not everybody was actually on the same page about what the mission of the company was, which might sound like a difficult thing to end up in that place. I mean, how could you have a company that people didn't know they weren't on the same page about the mission? But, I take responsibility. It's my job to make that clear. And we had people kind of with very different views about what the mission of the company was and what we should work on. And so what I did was I had a clarifying moment and I said, this is what our mission is. And also we're going to focus on that. One of my big beliefs is that if you have a big important mission like Coinbase does to create an open financial system for the world, there's a lot of hard problems in the world to solve, and it takes a lot of smart people working really hard for many, many years, often decades, to try to move the needle on some big things like this. Like in our case, we're trying to create a new economy for the whole world that's has more economic freedom. That's not a small thing. So the only way you can do that is by having focus. Having focus, whether crypto is up or down, like we talked about earlier, having focus when other major issues are present in the world, which they were last year, many of them. And so that was kind of my way of saying, we have an important mission. I want us to all be aligned on it. And, there were some folks that we made an exit package basically available, because that was kind of me saying, look, it's my fault. If you signed up and you felt like the mission was something different, I want to make sure that, you're taken care of and you can find something that you're excited about working on. So that's what went down last year. It was a pretty interesting moment for us and for me as a CEO, but I think it helped us. It was probably the most important thing I did for the company last year, because it got everybody back on the same page. It got us all aligned, moving in the same direction. I think for the next 1,000 or 10,000 people who join Coinbase, that's going to be really, really important that's now clear. So that's what happened.
Yeah, I think one question I wanted to ask you, Brian, was, just thinking about the pricing of Bitcoin, the value of Bitcoin. We've just seen a lot of people talking about it and just tying themselves into knots on thinking about what is the intrinsic value? How do you price Bitcoin, or what is the value of it? What's the best model we have for how to think about it?
Yeah, so this question comes up a lot. People say, well, what is the intrinsic value? If it's zero, couldn't it just all go to zero? And there's some ways that you could, by the way, of course, people then always have to say, well, by the way, the US dollar isn't backed by anything, so it doesn't have intrinsic value. It used to be on the gold standard. A lot of people think the US dollar is still backed by gold. It's not. It hasn't been since the 70s or so. So how do I think about the intrinsic value of Bitcoin? I mean, look, you could tie yourself into knots and come up with some kind of an argument about intrinsic value, and maybe others here on the call, like Avichal or Dan or Garry, Marc might have other thoughts here. One way people think of it is if Bitcoin is a globally decentralized ledger or database, and you have to spend a little bit of a Bitcoin to do transaction fees if you want to make an entry in that ledger, it's kind of like the utility of it, the intrinsic value of it, is that it gives you write access to a global decentralized ledger. Okay, I mean, that's kind of interesting. I think rather than quibble over details, it might be fairer just to say, Bitcoin probably doesn't have intrinsic value, but that's okay. The value comes from people believing that it's useful and it has value. It is quite useful as a digital gold is like like a really probably the best form of money ever created, right? It's divisible and portable and fungible and all these kind of properties of money that you can go look up. So people believe it has value, and therefore it has value, which, by the way, is kind of like the US dollar. So that's how I think of it. I don't know if others on here have their own answer to that question.
Well, that is, I mean, I think this is, it's funny that I think people ask this question of Bitcoin when there are so many other things that you could ask the same question of. And so often the answer is actually just reflexivity, and it's sort of, the market has come to some sort of valuation methodology, and everybody sort of agrees on that methodology. And once everybody agrees on that, then it's kind of worth what the market says it's worth. And Bitcoin is actually no different than a lot of other assets in that way.
Yeah, that's true. It's kind of like, what is the price of Bitcoin? It's the price at which somebody is willing to sell it at any given time, sort of by definition. So I always find it funny. People sometimes they'll drive by like a house or something and be like, that's crazy. That the price should not be that high. Well, it should is a tough word there, because the price is whatever someone is willing to sell it at, almost by definition.
I think by far this is probably the topic that gets people to tie up in knots. I remember having to explain Bitcoin to my family back in India like last year, and this was a really, really hard concept to get across, especially because they're just so used to valuing gold and think of one way, and that is just something what people are willing to pay for. It's just a really hard concept to get across. Okay, I know you touched on culture, so I want to kind of stay on the culture topic. Over the last year, obviously, you folks have been dealing with the pandemic just like everybody else. You had a push to working all kind of in a remote distributed fashion. Like, how has that transition been, and how do you just see the remote distributed culture / setup at Coinbase going forward?
Yeah, totally. So last year, like everybody, we were figuring out how to react to the pandemic, and we got everybody working remote. And at that time, actually one of the engineers on our team came to me and was like, have we thought about just being a remote company? And my first thought was quite dismissive of it, actually. And I was like, no, I mean, I know that there's some companies like WordPress and GitLab that are fully remote, but yeah, I haven't seen any kind of great company culture built of, let's say over 1,000 employees that is fully remote. And so I just kind of discounted it as something that we wouldn't do. But over the next few weeks, I started kind of talking to more people and hearing interviews with them, people like Matt Mullenweg, and I started thinking more and more about it. And, one of the most important things that we do at Coinbase is one of our cultural tenets. We say top talent in every seat. We're trying to look for great talent. We're trying to look for people all over the place. And I also remember seeing that in our recruiting efforts and in our exit surveys, when people leave the company, one of the top cited reasons for why they either didn't accept the offer or why they left the company once they were already there was that it was commute. Like, they didn't live within 30 minutes or so of one of our 5 offices, anywhere in the world. And if you think about it, it makes total sense. Like, what percent of people live within half an hour of these 5 locations on Earth? It's like some tiny, fraction, less than 1%, right? So I also just started to think about it from my own point of view. I was like, it might be nice to go spend, a few months of the year in this location and get meet some people there and get that input, and like be able to work anywhere and not have to be tethered to our, headquarters in SF, or just be on the road, 250 days a year, like some CEOs visiting all the locations. So long way of saying, we decided to make the company what I call remote first, and indefinitely, including after the pandemic. And it turned out to be great. It's turned out to go really well. So, there's some, I won't say it's better in every single way. There's certainly some drawbacks, right? I think it's a little harder for people to build close relationships. We're still probably going to have offsites and things like that every quarter or so. We're already started doing that with some teams. There's a little bit of an open question about, are you getting the kind of spontaneous sort of things like walking by the water cooler or the lunch table in terms of creativity and collaboration? But so far, it's gone really well. I think productivity is up. The employees seem to really like it because they're getting to spend more time. I will say there's an exception to that, which is some people don't have quite enough space at home. And there's solutions to that with co-working and things that'll come out after the pandemic. But aside from that, people are saying they like having less commute or no commute. They like getting to spend more time with their family and friends. They feel healthier. They're getting more exercise because they have more time in their day. They're also finding that they're I think more than 50% of all employees at Coinbase now, something probably 60% or more, started since the pandemic, and they've never actually worked in an office with other employees. And there don't seem to be any concerns out there about onboarding and engagement and sense of belonging and training and all those things. So it's turned out to work much better than I think anybody expected. And we're planning to continue going into the future. So people can, I should clarify, remote first means people can come into an office if they want, and we will maintain offices in a bunch of different cities. But you're not expected to, and you don't have to. And so everybody is expected to work as if they are remote, even if they're in an office. And the exec team is setting an example here by we're not all going into any one office every day.
But I think you made an amazing point here on remote, which I think Mark and Ben spoke about a little earlier when they did their earlier Clubhouse show today, which is for a lot of people, like this is the new normal. Like I started a new job, working with some other people on this Clubhouse show a couple of weeks ago. And one of the things it struck me was when I talked to people, is a lot of people had just never experienced anything else because they're also new. And to your point, I think this is just the default that a lot of people know, and they've adapted very, very quickly, which kind of like really struck me. Okay, so I want to get to some of the topics that we've talked about in detail. And Avichal, I know you have thoughts on this, and so does Dan. You should get in. Let's talk about DeFi, and maybe for a lot of our audience who may know crypto but may not be familiar with like what DeFi is, please give us like a 101 explanation, and then why it's interesting to you. And also, Avichal, Dan, you should also feel free to jump in.
Yeah, sure. I'll kick it off. So DeFi stands for decentralized finance. And it's basically it represents a crop of new protocols and startups that have gotten created in the last 2 years or so that have started to recreate aspects of the financial system, but in a totally decentralized way. So, and these are basically being run with like smart contracts running on the Ethereum blockchain, which is, if you're not familiar with what smart contracts are, it's kind of like writing a piece of software that runs on these decentralized global computers. So it doesn't run on like a server in AWS or on someone's laptop or something like that. So an example of this kind of DeFi apps is people have created decentralized exchanges. They've created decentralized borrowing and lending marketplaces, things like that. And what's cool about it is that it's gotten a ton of traction. So, I think about $25 billion has been now gone into DeFi, which shows real product market fit where outside of just pure trading, which is what was probably the initial big use case around crypto. So I don't know, Avichal or Dan, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Everything said is exactly right. My mental model for it is if you think about Bitcoin, like the kind of breakthrough there is that the bits inside the computer are now money, which is different than when you log into your bank and it's a representation of money. It's an IOU from the bank, which ultimately is an IOU from the government. So it's IOUs all the way down. But in the case of Bitcoin, it's the bits are the money. It's a bearer instrument. And you really quickly realize, well, if that's money, how do I assert ownership over that money is with this private key, with this password, which is just another set of bits. And then you say, well, can't code just generate a password and then it knows the password. And so very quickly you can reason to this idea that actually you can now hand money to a piece of code, to a piece of software. And so for the first time, you can actually interact with a computer. You can interact with a piece of code, and actually that can be your counterparty. And if you think about it, a lot of the world is basically just here's a pile of money and here's a bunch of rules around that money and who has access to that money. And under some conditions in the future, please execute some instructions. And that's wills and trusts and escrow and securities and derivatives and mortgages and REITs. It's literally like $100 trillion of the world is basically just a pile of money and some rules around it. And so now we have this infrastructure that's a perfect fit for that. It can actually take money and execute on it, and it has instructions that you can sort of code into real code instead of legal code, instead of legal documents that are hundreds of pages long. And so it's this sort of uniquely perfect fit for all things money. And it's sort of the first place Brian was mentioning 25 billion. I was just looking at the stats. I mean, it's grown about 60x in the last year. It's not that many times in sort of the history of technology that you see a graph that basically just goes vertical. So it's pretty remarkable. And people have sort of, developers all over the world have figured out all sorts of, basically all of the basic primitives around the financial system. You have lending, you have derivatives, you have options, and the counterparty, it's remarkable. The counterparty is a piece of code. You're not even interacting with another human on the other side of it. And so for anybody who is thinking about, is crypto just sort of a giant Ponzi or speculative, I would really encourage them to go check out DeFi, because I think the innovation that's happening there and the fundamental utility that's being created at the intersection of the computer science and economics and money and code is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add is the thing that's exciting for me about DeFi, well, there are two. One is that it's truly permissionless. So I think, Brian, you talked about this before, but for the first 10 years of crypto, a lot of the infrastructure that was getting built was Coinbase, the interface between the fiat financial system and the crypto financial system. Whereas with DeFi, you have code and smart contracts and different protocols that anyone who has access to kind of a web browser or Git can actually fork, they can start working on, they can deploy a smart contract to. And so I think you're starting to see, to the second point, the composability of all these protocols. So you can use Uniswap with Compound and Compound with Maker, and all of these protocols start to benefit one another. And you're starting to see innovation in crypto that's moving much faster and more at the speed of software that you're used to kind of in the Web 2.0 world. Whereas I think for the last 10 years, a lot of it was a little slower because of the interface with the traditional regulatory environment.
Yeah, which I think, okay, I think this kind of is a good segue to something else Brian talked about, which is, I think over the last year or so, maybe a bit more, we have seen some increasing interest and adoption, especially from the Chinese government, in building stable coins and having the kind of the central financial institutions of these countries really lean into digital currency. India has been thinking of something similar. Brian, could you talk to us about just what is happening there? What is China doing interesting, and just kind of like the state of stable coins right now and how we see it playing out forward?
Yeah, sure. So of course, stablecoins make sense just because people always said, well, Bitcoin's kind of volatile, so how could it be used as a medium of exchange? And I think, by the way, it could still be used as a medium of exchange long term. But stablecoins came on the scene and offered something that kind of got rid of that whole volatility question. So there's decentralized stablecoins like DAI, like Dan was mentioning earlier, that use some really interesting kind of market making mechanics to try to stay pegged roughly to the value of a dollar. But there's also stablecoins which are now being issued by central banks. Now, as Sriram mentioned, China is probably the farthest ahead on this. In fact, I think they started on this probably about 6 years ago or something, which is kind of amazing. I believe it was one of the top 5 technologies that the Chinese government put out a notice. They said, we're going to invest in these, AI and quantum computing. And anyway, blockchain was one of them. And they decided, we are going to digitize the yuan and see if we can get that to be used by a bunch of people. So that project is now already live. I believe it's already being used by people. All the stuff that I read on it is translated, but it looks like it's really out there, and they've taken the lead. And so I think we're seeing a number of other countries now see that, and including the US, and say, hey, how can we have our own central bank digital currency? And I think my guess is that within this decade, we will see most major countries in the world have their own central bank digital currency. And of course, the US dollar as the global reserve currency, I think a lot of people are looking at that and thinking, hey, how can we make sure the US dollar stays as the reserve currency if the world increasingly moving digital and online is going to start to use these central bank digital currencies? So I think it's really important that the US does that and starts to look at it. Coinbase, well, I would say actually there's a few ways this could go down. So one is that there's already a stablecoin out there called USD coin, and that's backed by $1 in a bank account. And so that's an option. There's some companies that are using it, and I think it's at maybe 7 billion or so of USD coin that's now been issued. But the Fed may actually want to create their own central bank digital currency and not just adopt USD coin. And so if that happens, I think they'll probably reach out to various actors and say, who almost like put out an RFP, like who wants to come build this for the US government. And I think that might be kind of a cool thing.
Before we move on, I think one of your recent blog posts, or I think the interview with Tyler, you said something interesting. You said there's a perception, maybe from the crypto community, that regulators and people in government are maybe not as interested, maybe not as technologically savvy. But in your experience, you often found them really interested in wanting to find ways to make Bitcoin work, which I think is kind of connected to what you're just talking about now.
Yeah, that's true. I think, look, there's folks in government that have their hands full with all kinds of things going on. There's 5G and Huawei and quantum stuff, and so I think for a lot of them, cryptocurrency and Bitcoin is probably not super on their radar yet, but it's increasingly going to be. They keep reading more and more about it. And so one of the big jobs that I think we have as a industry and just a community around crypto, because I think, there's now probably somewhere between 5 and 10 million crypto holders in the US. So it's a pretty large number of US citizens. There's almost like a job that we have to go and educate our elected officials about why do we think this technology is important? Why do we want to have it in a free society? How can it bring more economic freedom to people? How can it bank the unbanked? How can it make the fees that are charged by financial services better and improve the settlement times, right? Like why does it still take 2 to 3 business days to move money between US bank accounts, whereas mobile money in Africa happens instantly, right? It feels like we're just not innovating. We're on these legacy systems like Swift and these kind of situations. So crypto is an opportunity for us to embrace and move ahead, kind of like the US embraced the internet, and a lot of the biggest internet companies got built in the United States. So that's some of the education and advocacy work that we have to do. I think, the worst case scenario is that there's some kind of, domestic terrorism financing or something like that. There's some kind of an overreaction or draconian law that gets put into place, and it sort of sets the industry back. And that would be a real tragedy, because it would mean that this really important technology innovation probably goes overseas, and the US is not able to benefit from it. So those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah, I know it's an important conversation. Okay. By the way, for folks, we usually end at 11, but this is so fascinating and there's so much interest. We've been at the max room ever on Clubhouse at 6K. We're going to keep going. Brian, if you have maybe 10, 15 minutes, I think this is super interesting.
Yeah.
Avichal, do you have something on stablecoins?
Yeah, I was going to say 2 things. One, for anybody who hasn't used something like USDC, go get a Coinbase account, get some USDC, get an ETH wallet, and send it to somebody. And once you use it, you realize how busted the banking system is. I mean, to Brian's point, it's just crazy that it takes 2 or 3 days for money to settle. I mean, at this point at Electric, we're sending, I would say, probably 2/3 of our seed investments actually happen over USDC, just because it's so much better. I mean, I can send money on a Saturday and get an investment done. So for anybody who hasn't tried it, I really encourage you to do that, because once you use it, you realize how busted the existing system is, and it's sort of like living in the future. You all of a sudden realize all the things that crypto could do. Similarly to DeFi, I think all of a sudden, you realize all of these things that you could be doing, and it is really a peek into the future. It's kind of like, I whenever I'm talking to founders or early entrepreneurs, it's sort of this thought exercise of, if you could go back to 1992 and know everything that you now know about what happened on the internet, and you could be playing around and have that sort of, live in the future sort of mentality, what are all the things you would do differently? And I think that's kind of the opportunity with crypto. You get this glimpse into the future of what's possible, and all of a sudden, I think your mind opens up to all the things that are possible that we're not yet doing.
Mm-hmm. But by the way, I want one quick comment. I would just say one thing I found is people from countries like India or China, where there's been much more programmatic advance in money. India, for example, has UPI. They actually get it, I think, a lot easier than folks here in the US who haven't seen a lot of that happening in the US. But okay, that's a topic for another day. Brian, okay, we spoke about DeFi. Talk to us about NFTs, non-fungible tokens, and maybe for a lot of our audience who's not extremely crypto savvy, what are they and how do they tie to everything from art to owning a piece of the last amazing shot in a basketball game? How does it all tie together, and why is it exciting?
Yeah, sure. So NFTs, non-fungible tokens, kind of a mouthful, but it basically means, when Bitcoin really kicked this whole thing off, and one of the things that it did in that Bitcoin white paper was it showed a way that you could have a provably unique digital item. It's kind of intuitive if you think about it. Like most of the digital things that we send around, like files or photos, like if someone sends you a photo, you could make infinite copies of that photo and send it to as many people as you want, right? But that's not something that you want with money. So Bitcoin is provably scarce, and there's a lot of cool, math that goes into that, which you can look at if you want. Now, NFTs sort of takes that idea and extends it a little bit and says, hey, what other kind of digitally unique items might we want to have? And you can do this now with art. You can do it with kind of sports memorabilia type collectibles on Top Shots. You can do it with domain names. You could, in the future, you could do it with things like concert tickets. You could do it with the metaverse. If you all are familiar with that and read about it, it's like there's going to be all kinds of things that we want to store in the metaverse and have actually own as property, like real estate and spaceships and like cool clothes and all kinds of stuff. And then if you think about artists out there, musicians and whatnot, like a lot of the deals that these artists get are honestly just terrible, where like there's so many different middlemen essentially between the people who want to buy their music and the artists themselves, that they end up getting just like pennies on the dollar. And so they want to find a way to have more of a direct relationship with their fans. NFTs are creating a way to do that, where they can either, I think in the future, they'll be able to actually have the individual songs. You could buy like a limited edition of this song, or you could buy merchandise and like know that you're directly supporting the artist. So long way of saying NFTs are kind of having a moment right now. There's like people are buying these sports things on Top Shots. There was one I was looking at today, OpenSea.io, which is like a NFT marketplace with like a lot of art and virtual worlds and stuff. There's like Decentraland. There's a whole bunch of them. But I think this is really going to take off once some of the metaverse stuff starts to really work, like in VR with Oculus, or once some of the big artists and musicians start kind of get on this and start wanting to have a direct relationship with their fans. I think that's when NFTs could be really big. So I don't know if anybody else on the chat wants to chime in as well.
Yeah, one thought. I mean, it's a little abstract, but I think one of the really fascinating things about NFTs is it kind of breaks the internet. Like the internet was really built on copy paste. And
it's not a provocative statement at all, Avichal.
Well, it's fascinating, right? Like as an early stage investor, when you see a piece of technology that does the opposite of the previous generation of technology, your ears start tingling a little bit, right? And so to me, it's really fascinating that it just breaks copy paste. Like I can provably own a thing, and nobody else can own it. And I think Brian's point on creators and musicians is I mean, you could do a whole show on that, Sriram and Arthi. I think like it's really fascinating because creators they're like internet native businesses, right? They are the modern small business. And so the way that they're embracing NFTs, I think, is really fascinating. And it's really coming out, I think, out of this sort of desire to not have platform risk. And everybody's sort of realizing, especially I think after the last couple of weeks, just the sheer amount of power that some of these platforms have. And so I think creators who are really on the cutting edge of embracing technology and understanding their fans and business, are starting to embrace NFTs in really novel and interesting ways. It's probably a whole show that you could do about all of the really creative things that creators are doing around this stuff.
So I think there's been a lot of interest. I remember I first came up with a couple of years ago when there was a startup which was doing this for stems, which are basically the beats that go into a song. And right now, without crypto, there's this incredibly complex ecosystem of royalties and figuring out who's owed what and just kind of simplify everything. I think it's super interesting. We should absolutely do a show. By the way, I think one tweet that somebody should check out is Matt Huang of Paradigm has a tweet talking about how NFT sales has been over $100 million in just the last 30 days. So there's obviously a lot of interest. So I think we should come back to this. I think there's a lot of interesting content here. We should get some group of people together to talk about it. Brian, I think talking about NFTs and DeFi, which I think one topic I want to get to is Ethereum 2.0. Could you tell us like why that is interesting and what and what it means for just like programmable crypto overall?
Yeah, sure. So, well, Ethereum is a blockchain that allows people to run smart contracts. It's what a lot of these NFTs are being built on. It's what DeFi is being built on primarily. So it has a really interesting developer community around it. And if you think of Bitcoin as kind of like digital gold, Ethereum is kind of like an app platform, if you will. So Ethereum 2 is really like the next generation of Ethereum, and it's working on a few different things like scalability and something called sharding. It's basically making a bunch of improvements to the platform that will help take this to the next level. There's so many people using the current Ethereum blockchain with all those things I just mentioned, DeFi and NFTs, that sometimes the fees are pretty high to actually make an Ethereum transaction. And it's basically becoming a bottleneck to the entire adoption of crypto, which, on one hand is good. It shows like more and more people are using it. But now that we have this bottleneck, I think scalability is going to turn out to be a huge focus. It's important that we get scalability working. And so, yeah, ETH2 should be one of those big efforts.
Okay, I want to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about, I would say, two things which I think you're really personally passionate about, which ties to crypto, but also is kind of a little outside. Could you talk to us about your work with Research Hub, why you care about it, and why that's so important?
Yeah, sure. So Research Hub is a project I've been working on the side. And one of the thoughts or observations I've had over the years is that scientific research is kind of slow and inefficient. And I wish that it worked more like open source software. And I mean that in a bunch of different ways. One is that a lot of people in science, they sort of do something in a vacuum. They're hiding it. They don't want anybody to know about it. It's secretive, and it takes years, and it gets peer reviewed in a journal, and you submit it. And by the way, the journals have all these fees, which are not very conducive to just everybody having access to it. And it finally gets out there, and finds out like maybe a lot of that research is not even reproducible by other people. And so I've talked to scientists over the years, and they've all been kind of frustrated with how research happens. And so Research Hub was a way for me to kind of try doing this with another team and help it get something off the ground that would make that research be more like open source software. So today it's a pretty simple V1. You can go there, sign up, and just say, hey, I'm interested in these particular areas of research. And you'll get kind of like a feed that is showing you the most relevant research. There's like millions of research papers published every year, and probably only like 1,000 of them really matter. So there's a lot of noise. But hopefully, starting with that simple kernel of an idea, we can kind of grow it over time to be a place where people can make original research and do, lab notebook software and all kinds of things. It's also a way for me to kind of experiment with crypto startups, because a lot of startups right now are trying to issue a crypto token to help bring a community together and basically reward the people who are helping build that community and contribute content. Reddit is experimenting with this with some Ethereum tokens in kind of place of those karma points that you earn on Reddit. And so this was a way for me to try that as well and sort of get an experience more hands-on of what the average crypto startup is experiencing in the ecosystem right now today as well.
But I love that, because I think you've spoken about this in the past, which is, the classic Reddit model, or, I think always the question has been somebody like Uber could actually give, drivers, like actual, piece of Uber in some ways they can't do it. I think that's another example you mention often in like many of your, interviews on this topic.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so I know we're way over time, and I want to end on like one last question, which is you've been really actively involved in philanthropic work, which also kind of ties to crypto. Could you talk to us about like what givecrypto.org is and why that matters to you?
Yeah, so I've just been learning more and more about philanthropy over the last few years, and I'm still very early in it. I don't think I'm that good at it yet, but I'm learning more. So anyway, Give Crypto was an idea that came up. I saw another charity out there called Give Directly that was doing direct cash transfers to people in need. And one thought that I had was, crypto actually might be a really good solution to this, because if you want to send $100 from here to Venezuela or something like that, there's just tons of fees, and there's also middlemen, and there's various people who might, take that money or run off with it on the way to it going to some end recipient. And so one of the things crypto is really good at is you can send small amounts of money to anybody in the world and get it directly into their hands. And so we tried doing that with Give Crypto. I helped raise some of the early money for it, along with some other folks in the crypto community. And we started making small cash payments to people in need. We did it in people all over the world. We did about 5,000 people in Venezuela, actually. And one of the things we weren't even sure, are people even going to be able to use this when we send them crypto? Like, are they going to know what it is? Do they have the right cell phones to use it? It turns out, by the way, something like 80% of people in Venezuela are running Android phones that are like Android 4, which is from back in around 2012. So it's an older operating system. We actually had to build a new version of a crypto wallet that ran on these older versions of Android. And one of the cool stats we saw was that I think over 90% of the recipients who got crypto in Venezuela were able to spend it. And they spent it either by going to these local merchants. There's actually surprisingly a number of merchants in Venezuela who accept crypto, or they were able to exchange it to cash and then spend that cash right away at a merchant that didn't accept it. And so that was a really cool experiment. The next step we're working on is basically expanding it and integrating it in various ways. With Coinbase is doing a pledge 1% thing, and our foundation will be in part sending maybe some money to Give Crypto amongst other charities, and seeing if we can just grow the number of recipients. I think this is kind of goes back to the mission of Coinbase, right? Creating the open financial system for the world. How do we give more economic freedom to people? And is anywhere that's going through economic crisis, or hyperinflation or people who are refugees or anything like that is kind of a good example where crypto can, I think, uniquely help them out. So yeah, givecrypto.org. You can check it out and even donate some crypto if you're willing to help us out.
Wow. Okay. I can't think of a better note to end on. Again, the site that Brian just mentioned was Give Crypto, or go check it out. And also Research Hub. And I think one of the things, by the way, I want to say is like when I was researching the episodes, like Brian has a lot of great written content out there. Highly suggest reading his blog posts and also his recent interview with Tyler Cohen. Okay, this has been amazing. I want to kind of quick wrap up. I know we're way over time. First, I want to thank everybody who listened. This is the biggest room Clubhouse has ever had. Definitely the biggest room we've had. We've blown past the usual 5K minute. We've been at 6K throughout. I have seen so many tweets and DMs. I'll try and get back to you folks. People have been loving this, and I think, Brian, I think just your stories and, everything about today has been amazing. So I want to thank all of our hosts, Arti, of course, Dan, Avichal, Garry, thanks so much for jumping in, Steven, and of course, now, the person we now know is the creator of Bitcoin, Marc Andreessen, or well, one of the Andreessens. And last but not least, I want to thank Brian. You're amazing, so thoughtful, so generous, and thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Sriram and Arti. I really appreciate it. This was an awesome chat, and I want to give a shout out to Garry Tan too. He was he's so humble, but he didn't mention this earlier. He was actually my first CEO coach. So after coming out of Y Combinator, I would go meet up with Garry about once a month and just ask him to pass on some knowledge about how to start a company. So that was really cool. Got us help get Coinbase off the ground. So thanks, Garry.
Thank you, Brian. You made me as a VC, honestly. So it's the pleasure is all mine. I thank you so much for just everything that you built, and finding product market fit is just magic. I mean, I feel like I've been chasing the dragon since our talk. I think it was Fringale on was it 4th Street in Soma, down the street from the first office, and I remember you saying, "Hey, we actually had to increase our credit limits with SVB for 4 times in a row that week." And so you're sold out of Bitcoin every single day. And what did it mean? And man, I'll never forget that day, because that was the day that it was clear you had product market fit. And so that's what seed investing is all about.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And thank you so much, Brian. By the way, Garry, that should be YouTube video. Idea for your next YouTube video right there.
Oh my God.
Yes. Okay, so thank you so much, Brian. Thank you. And look, I know you listen to the show. We have a tradition where we try and pick a song which matches the theme of the show every single night. And so to play us out today, Garry, can you play us out to Money by Pink Floyd? Everyone, thank you so much for tuning in tonight. We'll see you tomorrow with another exciting episode. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone. Good night, everyone. See you. Bye-bye.
Right.
Take care, everyone.